Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, great. Well, this is the third in a three-part series on origins. Yesterday at 12:30, I spoke on the origin of the universe. And last night, we were talking about the origin of life, referring to the origin of the first life on planet Earth. And we're going to wrap this up with a talk on the origin of humanity. And out there at our book table, you have these cards, which are basically summarizing the three talks, all in just a couple of paragraphs. So feel free to take that. And there's also a flip that you can fill out with contact information, and that will get you a free DVD where I tell a story of how my studies in astronomy during my childhood years brought me to faith in Jesus Christ 8 years before I met a Christian. So that's a free gift out there. By the way, it also includes me fielding questions from skeptics. And as I mentioned last night, when you look at what Genesis says about life, it really speaks about three separate origins of life. There's the origin of life that's purely physical, which is addressed in creation day 1. The origin of life that's both physical and soulish, which is addressed on creation day 5, a reference to animals that are endowed with mind, will, and emotions so that they can form relationships with human beings, a higher species. And then it speaks about the one and only species that is physical, soulish, and spiritual. And because of the spiritual capacity, that species and that species alone has the capacity to form a relationship with a higher being, namely God himself. Now, I have a talk prepared where I talk about the second origin of life, but I've written a whole book on that. It's called Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, because it's the book of Job in the Bible that really gives the most detail on this second origin of life and how God created these birds and mammals to teach human beings important lessons. And in one respect, I argue in this book that people today are more ignorant about science than people lived 4,000 years ago, in the sense that people lived 4,000 years ago had intimate contact with both domesticated and wild birds and mammals, whereas most people on Earth today do not, including professors of science that are leading universities. So in some respects, we're not as well educated in science as people that lived thousands of years ago. But really my objective today is to talk about the third origin of life, the origin of spiritual life, or you can refer to it as the origin of humans. And this is the standard story that we have a common descent from knuckle-walking primates that existed several million years ago. And another theory is that we actually owe our origin to an even more primitive bipedal primate. And depending whether you're living in Texas or in Canada, I put a hockey player here. I mean, whatever sports bias you have, I think you can make that work. But the story is that we have the origin of the first life form some 3.8 billion years ago, and how that single bacterium, according to the naturalist model, evolved through gene exchange, natural selection, and mutations over a long period of time into us human beings. Now, what's interesting is that there are two sets of researchers who actually tried to calculate the probability that beginning with a bacterium, you could wind up with the equivalent of human beings, some kind of intelligent physical life form. And these authors were simply making the point, yes, with the naturalistic model, you've got gene exchange, you have mutations, you have natural selection, but those mechanisms always favor simplicity over complexity. And so what they've done is to identify the complex jumps or quantum jumps you have in the pathway from bacterium to human beings. And one such calculation was first done by Francisco Ayala. He's one of our nation's leading evolutionary biologists, a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and he calculated that the probability was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 1 millionth power that you would wind up with human beings or the functional equivalent, starting with bacterium some 3.8 billion years ago. Now, it was three physicists, John Barrow, Brandon Carter, and Frank Tipler, who pointed out that Francisco Ayala had left out some steps. And so they included some additional steps and wound up with a probability of less than 1 chance in 10 to the 24 millionth power. Now, what's interesting about these two studies, they were basically done to rule out the possibility of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligent life. Francisco Ayala said, with a probability that tiny, we know we must be alone. There's no way that on any other planet a bacterium would wind up producing the equivalent of human beings, and therefore he advocated that we should stop funding the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life. Now, most lay audiences have a hard time understanding what this probability is really like. I'll try to give you an analogy. I don't know whether you've got a lottery here in the state of Colorado. I know we have one in California. California's got 10 times the population of Colorado, so it's a little harder to win the California lottery. But to give you an idea of how tiny this probability is, it's equivalent to one of you winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times, where you buy one ticket each time. Or as a mathematician pointed out to me, it's the same as the probability of you winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times where you don't buy any tickets at all. There's really no difference in the probability. And if you read the scientific literature, it's rare to find probabilities anywhere approaching this. I mean, when I was taught physics, I was told if you can demonstrate that something is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 50th of happening, then it's impossible. It will never happen. Well, here we're looking with probabilities much more remote. Now, what was overlooked by Francisco Ayala and Barrow and Carter and Tipler, not only does this probability apply to extraterrestrial intelligent beings on another planet, it applies to this planet Earth. That from a naturalistic perspective, it's simply impossible that a bacterium would evolve through gene exchange, natural selection, and mutations into human beings. It can't happen. There must be another explanation for how we human beings got here, which is why I'm suggesting we need to look for a supernatural explanation rather than a natural explanation, because of the probability that tiny, it simply can't happen. But another challenge to human origins is that, unlike a bacterium, we're a conscious being. We have consciousness. How does one get conscious spiritual beings from something that's non-conscious matter? And here we're dealing with the principles of cause and effect that undergird all the sciences, namely that effects cannot be greater than their causes, and the created cannot be greater than the creator. And thus, the living, the personal, the mindful, the conscious, and spiritual cannot come from that which doesn't have any consciousness or personality, can't come from that which is purely physical, non-living, impersonal, unconscious, mindless, and non-spiritual. Now, again, I've written extensively on this. I'm only going to give you one example of what this challenge is all about. When Darwin wrote his book, Origins of Species, and when he followed that up with his book on human origins, The Descent of Man, that he published in 1871, one thing he said in that book is that the properties of the human mind come about the same way as the properties of our human body. He claimed that just like we got our human body from natural descent from species that preceded us, likewise that's how our mind evolved. And therefore he declared the human mind only differs by degree, not by kind, from the minds we see in animals. And I would agree with him, we do see minds in the higher animals. Now, he also proposed that this needed to be put to the test and suggested experiments that actually determine whether or not the human mind is unique in terms of its functionality, or whether we simply differ by degree with the animals. But what I found interesting is that for 145 years, no scientist did any of the experiments that Darwin suggested. It happened for the first time just 6 years ago. University of California, Los Angeles, 3 authors decided to put this to the test, published a paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and the title of their paper was Darwin's Mistake, explaining the discontinuity between human and non-human minds. And this is what they said in their paper, that there's a significant discontinuity in the degree to which human and non-human animals are able to approximate the higher order systematic relational capabilities of a physical symbol system. Now, That's a bit of jargon. Let me try to break that down for you. Unlike all of you, there's not a single non-human animal that can appreciate the beauty, the elegance, and the meaning of these gorgeous Higgs field equations. I mean, try this on your dog. They're not going to be able to appreciate the meaning or the beauty of the elegance of these Higgs equations. But hey, we don't have to go to the Higgs equations. Those of you that are older will remember going to school and learning how to read with a series of books called Fun with Dick and Jane. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but that's how I was taught to read. But this is the first page of the first Fun with Dick and Jane reader. Now, no non-human animal can understand any of the words in even the first page of the first Fun with Dick and Jane reader. That's unique to human beings. Matter of fact, you cannot find a non-human animal that can actually understand what any of these very simple symbols are all about. I mean, walk with your dog. They're not going to be able to figure out what the stop sign means or the yield sign means. But this is something that's easy for humans. Matter of fact, we see this even in very young children. A child at a year of age actually is beginning to develop this symbol capability. And so these three authors concluded their paper with this sentence, that the symbol relational discontinuity pervades nearly every domain of cognition. And actually, this is an active debate just in the last 2 weeks in the scientific literature. And what's happening is papers are being published where they're saying, look at these very bright non-human animals. They are able to communicate. They're able to vocalize. But vocalization and communication is not the same as language. I mean, a parrot can develop a vocabulary of 100 words, but try to get a parrot to put together a paragraph that's got meaning independent of what it's simply mimicking. It can't do that. But a very young child, even a year of age, is able to make that happen. And incidentally, another experiment was done to challenge Darwin's hypothesis, because his point was, if our human mind is the product of natural descent, the properties of our human mind should be most similar to that of the chimpanzee. Well, there were several experimenters at the University of California, San Diego, a year after this paper was published, began to do experiments on the higher animals and quickly discovered that chimpanzee does not rank the closest to human beings in intellectual capability. The animal that gets the top rank is the raven. Now, would any evolutionary biologists claim that we're the product of natural descent from a raven? I don't think so. But what would they notice about the raven? The raven, without any human training, is able to take a tool and use that tool to recover a completely different tool to get a food treat. But a chimpanzee, in fact, none of the great apes are able to do that. They can use a tool, but they can't use a tool to take another tool to recover a food treat, unless you're willing to train that ape for a period of many months. But then it's just simply mimicking what you've taught it. But the raven has incredible intellectual capability, and yet it's not what we would expect from the physical features of the raven. Now, I want to define some terms in terms of human origins, because really the whole debate is, what is our relationship with the bipedal primate species that preceded us human beings? And so, cavemen, that's often a term that's used for these creatures, but hey, I know men that had caves in their homes, so we need to be careful about that term. And the first humans, many of them lived in caves. By the way, Cro-Magnon was a very common term to try to identify certain primates that are distinguished from human beings. That term no longer appears in the scientific literature. Cro-Magnon is identical to human beings. It was a term applied to humans that lived more than 10,000 years ago. But because we now know that human origins dates back a few tens of thousands of years, this term has disappeared from the scientific literature. Homo sapiens is not the same as human beings. Scientifically, we're referred to as Homo sapiens sapiens, which means, unlike the other primates, we think twice. Homo sapiens sapiens, the term Homo sapiens is a broad term that refers to human beings. It refers to Neanderthals. It refers to Homo sapiens idaltu, which is kind of a tropical Neanderthal, and also several other species. So it's more of a genus than it is a species. So be careful about that term Homo sapiens. And then bipedal primate is a reference to those dozen or so species that, like us, tend to be a body mass of more than 20 kilograms and walks on two legs. But then there's two categories of bipedal primates, what we call obligatory bipedal primates and non-obligatory primates. The difference is the non-obligatory will frequently walk on all fours, but they can't walk on two legs. But obligatory bipedal primate is referring to those species that must walk on two legs. They can't walk on all fours. So that would be an R category, Neanderthals in that category, as well as Homo erectus being in that category. Now, we know today that there's about a dozen different species of bipedal primates that precede human beings. They seem to be discovering a new one every year. And the reason why we keep coming up with these discoveries is that these bipedal primates, every one of them, is a small population. It's not like the mice and rats. It's not like us human beings today. We're talking a very limited number. Probably in the thousands or tens of thousands, but not in the millions. And also, these species are not global, they're localized. In fact, there are 3 continents that have no history of bipedal primates. Australia, North and South America, there is 0 evidence for bipedal primates that precede human beings. Whereas with Africa, there's about a dozen different species. Asia has a little bit less than that, and Europe probably just 3 or 4. And they existed anywhere from 6.5 million years ago to about 33,000 years ago. I say 33,000 because there's a new species discovered that they really don't know how to classify. Homo florensis. This is a primate that they found in Indonesia. And 3 feet tall, brain capacity about that of a chimpanzee, which is less than 1/4 of our brain capacity, and lived somewhere between 94,000 and 13,000 years ago. But there's debate exactly how to classify that particular species. With respect to the bipedal primates, what we notice is that the fossil record is not a tree. I had some people discussing this with me yesterday, making the point, well, don't we actually see the brain capacity smoothly increasing with respect to time? And the answer is no. You see quantum jumps, and sometimes the brain capacity actually drops and then comes back up. And we see the same thing with a bipedal capability. It's not a smooth transition over a period of time. What we really see is that the fossil record is a hedge. And in fact, what's been commented on in the scientific literature is that every new find, every time we find a new species of a bipedal primate, it adds chaos to the naturalistic model rather than bringing some kind of consensus or improvement in the naturalistic model. Things are getting more out of sync rather than becoming more in sync. Okay, this creature, Homo sapiens, not a human. It's really a reference to tropical Neanderthal types. I say that because Neanderthal was wonderfully designed to live in a cold climate. Unlike us, Neanderthal had a barrel-shaped body, very short limbs, and enormous nasal capacity so it could breathe cold air. Well adapted, but then there's other Homo sapiens creatures that, unlike the Neanderthals, are able to live in a tropical region. And they lived roughly 80,000 to 170,000 years ago. But because we're looking at tropical ones, the number of fossil specimens we have of these is extremely small. We have a lot of Neanderthals because they lived in a cold area. They lived in caves where the probability of preservation of their dead remains is much higher than it was for these tropical types. And we see no symbolic capability in any of these creatures. And not a worshiper. I mean, this is one of the unique features of human beings. As soon as you see human evidence for human beings, you immediately see that they are building temples and altars and engaging in some kind of expression of worship of a higher being. We don't see that in any other species. Now, what about Neanderthal? Now, with Neanderthal, we have lots of complete skeletons. It's the best preserved of all the bipedal primate species that preceded us. and we got DNA. There's only 2 species of bipedal primates that precede human beings where we got recoverable DNA. Doesn't mean there isn't DNA in the others, but it's so corrupted that it doesn't give us any information. But with Neanderthal, we have over 20 specimens where we've got mitochondrial DNA and a handful where we got Y chromosome DNA. What we notice is we can't measure any significant evolution in the DNA. Either geographically, Neanderthal was spread from, say, Spain over into Siberia, and if you look over that whole geographical area, we can't see any significant change in the DNA, nor can we see any change over the history. The oldest Neanderthals are manifesting the same DNA as the most recent. And the DNA is distinct from us human beings. Now, it's only distinct by 1%, but 1% is a huge distinction. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And they have a distinct morphology. Now, when I went to undergraduate, I was told in my classes that Neanderthals were anatomically identical to us. We now know that's not true. I told you about the different skeletal features. The hole that takes the spinal column has an elliptical shape, whereas for us it has a circular shape. But the biggest difference of all is the nasal capacity. In fact, Neanderthal has such an enormous nasal capacity that anthropologists have concluded it can't be the product of descent from any other possible mammalian species, because no other mammalian species anything close to the enormous nasal capacity of human beings. But critical, given that it's breathing cold air into its lungs without the benefit of a parka. That's another thing that we notice, is that none of these bipedal primates wear clothes. So they were having to make do without clothing. And again, no symbolic capability and not a worshiper. What about Homo erectus? What's interesting about Homo erectus is how long Homo erectus survived upon the scene. The most recent, 200,000 years ago, the most ancient, 1.8 million years ago, and some argue that maybe it extended as far back as 2 million years ago. And we have no DNA, and the DNA, and we do have morphology, however. These creatures are much smaller than human beings and Neanderthals and slim, again designed to live in a warm climate. The tallest were about 5 feet tall. And over this whole period of 1.6 million years, we can't observe any change in the bone structure of these Homo erecti species. Namely, that over that 1.6 million years, we don't really see anything happening. And by the way, we got a good idea why. The literature of conservation biology needs to be integrated with the literature on evolutionary biology. And if you read the literature on conservation biology, you'll see a number of papers making the point. If a mammal has an adult body size bigger than 3 kilograms, bigger than 7 pounds, that's a species that will go extinct before it has the possibility of evolving into a different species. And with the bipedal primates, their adult body size is way bigger than 7 pounds. Now, in terms of the nucleotide differences, what we see is that the average nucleotide differences amongst human beings is 30. So there's not a lot of differentiation there. But if you compare it to Neanderthals, 202, that's how far apart we are. And with the Denisovans, which is a small location in Siberia, they found a couple of caves where they found these creatures that kind of look like Neanderthals. Maybe they are Neanderthals. There's a debate about that. Some argue it might be distinct species. We got very limited finds, but it looks like their DNA differs even more. And if you want to look at the chimpanzees, it's a considerable difference. But by simply looking at these nucleotide differences, clearly we see that these species are distinct from human beings. Now, this raises a question, however. We're talking 7 pounds. It's going to go extinct before it's able to evolve. Raises an obvious question. Why would a creator God create a dozen distinct species over 6 million years? What's the purpose? And it was actually an atheist anthropologist, Ian Tattersall, who was at a conference along with my colleague Fuzz Rana, that gave a suggestion why. And he pointed out that when human beings entered into Australia, North America, and South America, they quickly wiped out the most important bird and mammal species they needed to launch and sustain civilization. And consequently, notice is that when humans came into those continents, they were stuck in the Stone Age. They were never able to launch themselves out of a Stone Age technology. They lacked the very animals they needed to do that. That's something, by the way, you see in the book of Job, where it speaks about specific bird and mammal species that God created to help launch human civilization. Creatures like the cow, the donkey, the horse. And these are the creatures that got wiped out when humans entered that area. And what Ian Tattersall points out, for example, in Australia, when humans entered, they wiped out in a short period of time 94% of the large-bodied bird and mammal species, and hence we're stuck in the Stone Age. North America, the extinction rate was 73%. South America, 79%. Ian Tattersall said the survival rate was greater there because you're dealing with bigger continents. And you can see the correlation there. Now, notice sub-Saharan Africa, the extinction rate was only 4.5%. But sub-Saharan Africa had all the bipedal primates except for the Neanderthals. And in Asia, which had almost as many as sub-Saharan Africa, extinction rate 14%, and Europe 30%. Now, from a biblical perspective, we would recognize that God would know ahead of time that we human beings would fall into sin. And in falling into sin, we would abuse the very animals that God created to help serve and please us. And so in anticipation of that, we're suggesting that God purposely created the sequence of bipedal primates, each one a little more effective and capable of hunting large-bodied bird and mammal species. And we know that Neanderthals, for example, were the most effective of all. And this would give the opportunity for these bird and mammal species over the course of a few million years to gradually adapt to the coming future shock of the super predator. Of all the predators that have ever existed on planet Earth, we're the only ones that can kill anything we want. All the other predators have to be satisfied with killing the weak, the sick, the dying, and the injured. We can kill anything. But because we can kill anything, we typically prefer to go after the best within the herd. And by doing that, we endanger those animals with extinction, since we're removing the best rather than removing those that are the weakest. Now, with respect to human beings, the Bible says that we're all descended from two individuals, Adam and Eve. It makes the point that that is God's final creation miracle, that we're the only spiritual beings that God created in the face of the earth. We're the only beings that actually care whether or not God exists. We're the only human beings that engage in mathematics and philosophy and ask questions like, why am I here? Or why is this universe here? I got a very intelligent dog, and I've never seen him address those kinds of issues. He just wants to know where his food dish is and how many pets he can garner from the different members of our family. And Adam and Eve are the progenitors of all human beings. Now, in terms of the biblical date for when God created Adam and Eve, the genealogies really aren't of much help. If you read it in the original Hebrew, it's clear that there's missing generations. We're getting the highlights. We're not getting an exhaustive generation. In fact, if you look at the genealogies in the Bible, you'll see that names are missing in each one of them. For example, in Luke, we see a name for the genealogy going back to Adam that includes 11 names between Adam and Noah, whereas the one in Genesis has just 10 names. Clearly, generations are missing. The question is it possible to calibrate the biblical genealogies? And we actually argue, by the way, the reason why there's missing names, it's making a theological point. The names that the genealogies select, some genealogies, for example, making a point to mention women, making the point that the Gospels for men and women. Others mention Gentiles, others mention significant people who have committed great sins, meaning that your sins can be forgiven. It's making theological points. But what's interesting about the Genesis genealogies is that we got a very good historical date for Abraham. Abraham is not found just in the Bible. It's also found in extra-biblical historical records documenting that he lived about 4,000 years ago. And then Peleg. What does it tell us in Genesis 10? The world was divided in the days of Peleg. I believe that's a reference to the breaking of the great land bridges during the last ice age. And we can date that with some precision. For example, during the last ice age, Siberia was joined with Alaska with a land bridge. England was joined with France. Japan was joined with Korea, etc. Well, in terms of the Bering Land Bridge, this is what it says in the text, by the way. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because in his time the world was divided. This is what the Bering Land Bridge looked like 21,000 years ago. Here's Alaska here and Siberia here, and you've got a 500-mile wide land bridge. And this is what it looked like about 11,500 years ago, where the Bering Strait begins to form for the first time. Now, about 14,000 to 12,000 years ago, this land bridge was a little narrow, but was passable. It was interesting. The average temperature was 56 degrees, which means that humans could count on wild oats and other wild grains that they could harvest as they move across the Bering Land Bridge. So with that date for Peleg and that date for Abraham, and if we simply assume that the passage of time is proportional to the lifespans mentioned in the text, this is a date that you would roughly get for when God created Adam and Eve. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 to 40,000 years ago. That's during the last ice age. The last ice age lasted from 20,000 to 120,000 years ago. A rough date. Well, we can also get a crude date from looking at the cultural Big Bangs. So these are the dates we get when you look at the birth of culture in Europe. By the way, you get an earlier date for South Africa and East Africa than you do for Europe. But what's interesting is when you look at the African dates, just like with the European dates, they're consistent. They fall in the neighborhood of, say, 70 to 80,000 years ago. For Europe, it's roughly 40,000 years ago, but it indicates when humans come upon the scene, there's a sudden burst in the use of clothing, language, complex tools, jewelry, art, and music. And what's interesting, too, when you look at these ancient finds, the jewelry always far outweighs the tools. I think it's the same today. Then we can also get a crude date by looking at the mitochondrial DNA. And what that shows us is that indeed the DNA data for humans, and what people do is they look at DNA all over the human population. All of you, for example, have got mitochondrial DNA, but you only get it from your mother. Your father makes a zero contribution. So by sampling this DNA and then digging up humans that have been dead for 10 or 20,000 years, we can actually come up with whether or not we're descended from many females or one or a few females. And the data is consistent with all of us owing our descent to a single woman. But it's also consistent with the possibility we owe our descent to a few women. That's still being worked out. That we live near the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe. If you read the scientific literature, you'll see papers saying East Africa, other papers saying maybe the Levant. The whole point is the location you get has an error bar of about plus or minus 2,000 miles. So it's a crude estimate. It's not as accurate as what you might think by reading the popular literature. In terms of a date, the date you get for the first woman through this mitochondrial DNA is 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. However, that does not take into account that 10% of you got 2 sets of mitochondrial DNA and 1% of you have 3 sets of mitochondrial DNA. When you take into account that heteroplasmy and triplasmy, you actually get a much more recent date, roughly 50,000 years ago. Now, we also notice that we cannot measure any significant evolution in human mitochondrial DNA over the past 35,000 years. And with men, we all have Y chromosomes, and we only get it from our fathers. But we notice there, it's also consistent with us being descended from a single man. And also, it tells us that that single man lived roughly at the same location of the first woman. That's a good thing for all of us, that they lived roughly at the same location. And the date we get is, again, not very accurate, 50,000 to 160,000 years ago. But once again, we don't see any significant change in the evolution here. Now, What I want to point out here is in all three cases, the biblical date, the cultural date, the DNA date, all of them are very crude. We're basically looking at error bars of plus and minus 100%. But what I want you to notice is they're all falling in the same ballpark. The numbers are consistent. And 30 years ago, that wasn't the case. It is the case today. The conclusion you can draw from this, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, outside the table, you'll see a book titled Who Was Adam? And by the way, we're bringing out a new edition on that, but that's our book on human origins and covers the details of the biochemistry and the fossil record in much more detail than I covered today. And as I mentioned yesterday, we've given these kinds of talks on origins in front of audiences on many university campuses. I've now spoken on more than 300 university campuses on these topics. But probably the most interesting time I gave a talk was at the International Skeptics Society Conference, where they invited atheist skeptics from all over the world. 700 of them showed up at Caltech for a weekend conference. It was 6 leading atheist scientists speaking for all day, well, Friday night and all day Saturday. At the very end, they had me debate Victor Stenger. And it was called The Great Debate. That's the title the skeptics put on it. It's not our title. But outside, we actually give you the entire debate plus all the Q&A. What's interesting about the Q&A, they started off with me and Victor Stenger fielding questions from this atheist audience. But then they invited all the speakers to come up. So at the end, you get to see an exchange that we had with all the speakers. Also, I thought what was especially interesting is that both Victor and I spoke, but then we sat down and had a conversation with one another. A lot of debates I've been to, you get the two debaters talking past one another. So this is a debate where there's actually some significant engagement. And you won't believe what Victor Stenger says at the very end. They give him the last word. Listen carefully to what he says at the very end. You can get this from the Skeptics Society for $30. Outside, we're selling it for $5. We want people to see what happens when this kind of evidence is presented in front of a highly educated and very hostile audience. Some other resources you can get. This is the one on the second origin of life, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, why the universe is the way it is, which really takes on the problem of evil. And hey, all of the scholars at Reasons to Believe maintain a Facebook page and a Twitter page where we try to keep you up to date on the latest scientific findings. But before we go to Q&A, let me talk to you about the latest findings we've had about the significance of human beings and particularly human civilization. Namely, that we're now living in an ice age. But to be more accurate, we're living in an ice age cycle. And by the way, ice ages are rare in the history of the Earth. Most of the time, Earth has no ice at all. Only a few occasions. And by the way, the times we do have ice ages are at the same time we have what are called the great oxygenation events. So the oxygen content all the way through here was way less than 1%. Then it jumped up to 1 or 2%, came back down, stayed about 1%, and then jumped up to 8%, then 10%, and this is where you get the ice ages. But there's only one time in the entire history of the Earth where we have an ice age cycle, where the ice covering the Earth goes from 10% to 23% with a regular cycle that's driven by the variation in the eccentricity of Earth's orbit. And that's only existed for the last 2.5 million years. And this is what it looks like. And so right now we're in an ice age cycle of about 100,000 year period. And this is the current one we're in. We're in what's called a warm interglacial, where the ice coverage is only 10%. But if you go back 12,000 years, the ice coverage was 23%. And in fact, there was a huge amount of ice covering all of the Tibetan Plateau. Here's another warm interglacial. But what I want you to notice is, throughout this whole ice age cycle, we see climate instability. The temperature is going up and down quite radically throughout the whole ice age cycle, except for where we are right now. And here's a more expanded look at it, where you can see the temperature variation. Now, humans were existing throughout this ice age, but there was no advanced civilization. there was no intensive agriculture. When the temperature is varying this rapidly, it's impossible to establish intensive cultivation. Intensive cultivation does not begin until we have this extreme climate stability. Global warming, I know, is a big issue. Part of the problem is we human beings in the 21st century think we have the right to permanent, stable climate. The truth is we're living in the one epoch in the history of the Earth where we have this optimal temperature and this extreme climate stability. The Earth is 4.57 billion years old. Only in the last 9,000 years have we had this exceptional climate stability. But without that, you can't have 7 billion people on the face of the Earth. When our family celebrates Thanksgiving, we thank God for this ice age that we had here. Because what did it do? It made possible melting glaciers from the last ice age, watering the great agricultural plains. And what happened as the ice began to recede, wind blowing dust enriched the plains. There would be no way Asia could support 3 billion people if it wasn't for wind blowing dust coming off the Tibetan highlands and settling on the plains of India and China. And how the glacier retreat created millions of lakes. Canada would be a desert if it wasn't for the millions of lakes that were formed during the last ice age. By the way, Canada's got more lakes than the rest of the world combined. But the only reason you got forests, lush forests all over Canada is because of the extreme abundance of lakes and rivers connecting it. And then you got hydropower, and then it also formed warm land bridges to facilitate human migration. Glacier retreat recreated beautiful harbors that would enable trade. This is the School of Mines. How many of our ore deposits were created and exposed by the retreating glaciers of the last ice age? And what makes human civilization so special, of all the ice ages we've had during the ice age cycle, the last one was the most severe. And the severity of the last ice age is really what's making possible our human civilization today. So this is a debate not just about biochemistry and bones, it's also a debate about humans and the way the Earth has been designed to enable us to establish a global high-technology civilization with billions of us living on the planet at the same time. We'll take the remainder of the time for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. As we go into the question and answer time, some of you, or should be all of you, should have a card in front of you with a writing utensil. As we go into question and answer, we'll kind of go back and forth between a written question and one from the floor, as you wish. So even if you ask one verbally out loud in front of everyone, would you please go ahead and write that down still? And that way we can just kind of respond to you via email or something and make sure that you feel your question was answered adequately and follow up that way. So whether you wish to write it or say it verbally and write it, either way, we'll take questions at this time. As we do that, I will limit it to one question per person per time, and we especially want to emphasize the students. So I'll start off with any student questions specifically, although I don't want to discourage other questions. But if you really want a question answered, try to look like a student as much as you possibly can. All right? No, but we realize some of the students have class schedules and things, so we want to be very kind to them and make sure that they get their questions answered first. So with that, we do have some folks who are collecting those questions. As you write them down, you can pass them to the end of the row. They'll collect them and bring them up to me. But we'll begin with any question from the floor. Right there. Yes, sir.
Hi. So in the absence of evolution, how do you propose new species come into existence?
Okay, I'm not saying that naturalistic evolution does not produce new species. I mean, if you read the biological literature, you'll find 16 different definitions of a species. So it really depends what you mean by a species. Some definitions are very broad, some definitions are very narrow. And we actually do observe some of the narrower definitions of species taking place in real time. And from God's perspective, you could see there would be an advantage to create species with the capability of adapting to environmental change. The real question is, would gene exchange, natural selection, mutation explain all the changes that we see in the history of life? And our position at Reasons to Believe is no, it does not. There are significant examples where you would need intervention. A good example would be, for example, the Avalon and Cambrian explosions, where you have the planet going from no animals at all to suddenly animals showing up. I mean, even Richard Dawkins has made the claim these animals show up without any evolutionary history. And they also show up immediately after the oxygen goes from 1% to 8% and 10%. There's no time lag between the oxygenation that actually physically permits for the first time the existence of these species and their appearance. Moreover, what you notice with the Cambrian explosion, 86% of the mathematically conceivable body plans or phyla all show up at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. They all come up at one, and that includes our own phyla. The chordates, including vertebrates, are present at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. So that's a couple of examples where you're going to have to appeal to something outside of natural process to explain where all life came from.
A written question from a student. It says that many verses in the Bible say all animals before the fall were herbivores only, and also that punishment for sin resulted in death. So how could animals die before the fall of Adam and Eve, or did they?
Right. I think that's a reference to Genesis 1:31, where God is basically making the point to Adam and Eve. I'm putting you in charge of all the resources of the planet. Manage those resources, not just for your benefit, but for the benefit of all life. And then take care of the green plants. And it's using a generic term, desheh, in the Hebrew for these green plants. And actually refers to all plants that engage in photosynthesis. And what I think the text is making is God is instructing the human species, if you don't take good care of the green plants, nobody gets to eat. That's the base of the food chain. The herbivores eat the green plants, the carnivores eat the herbivores, the parasites also need those green plants in order to survive. So I don't think it's a reference to the fact that there was only herbivores existing. I do agree, however, that up until the time of the flood, humans were herbivorous. Because what God says in Genesis 9, after the flood, before you could only eat vegetables, now you can also eat meat. And there's a reason. Before the flood, human beings had the potential to live 800 or 900 years, and eating meat would be a problem if you want to live that long. You're going to concentrate too many heavy metals in your body. But basically God is saying, hey, at best it's 120 years, you can eat meat, it's not going to make any difference. Now, the other passage I think this person is referring to is Romans 5:12 to 19. Romans 5:12 has often been misquoted that death came through Adam's sin. But if you actually read the whole verse, it says death through sin was visited upon all men. Now notice that Paul here is making two careful qualifications, because in the book of Romans, he addresses 4 different kinds of death. And he says, this is death you get through sin. Well, only one species is capable of sin, human beings. The animals don't sin, we do. So he says death through sin, he's narrowing in on human beings. And notice how he closes up the passage. Death to all men, he does not say death to all life. And if you look in the book of Proverbs and Psalms and Job, you actually see statements where God is showing his love to the lion and the raven by providing them with prey. And therefore it's making the point that carnivorous activity is not necessarily an evil. And I think that's often the error that's being made, that through Adam's sin, this evil of carnivorous activity came in. But the truth is, the death of herbivores would skyrocket, and the suffering of herbivores would skyrocket if you take away the carnivores. And there's plenty of field experiments that demonstrate that. Carnivores actually enhance the longevity and the health of the herbivores. Why? Because they hunt differently than we do. Rather than going after the best, they take care of the disease. And by taking care of the disease, that protects the rest of the herbivores. Matter of fact, there's a really good DVD you can watch on PBS. It shows this herd of walruses and these grizzly bears coming along and hugging each walrus. Now, it's not because they're being affectionate towards the walrus. They're trying to figure out which walrus is sick. And by figuring out which walrus is sick, it pulls it up. But what you notice is all the rest of the walruses tolerate this. They actually welcome the grizzly bear coming by and hugging them all and picking out the one that's sick and then eating that one. And that actually protects the walrus herd, because now they got rid of the diseased one that could be a problem for the rest of them.
All right, another question from the floor. Let's go here.
I heard John Lennox make a comment as a reference to evolution and creation, where he said an extra input of information was needed to start life and so forth, where he said God spoke twice on 2 different days. Genesis, the 3rd day, I think the 3rd day of creation, where God separated land from water, and then he spoke again and created plants. And then on the 6th day, God created land-dwelling animals, and then he spoke a second time and created humans. And so he's saying that reference to God speaking twice on those days said that an extra input of information was needed to, rather than having things go along naturally, information was needed to start these new life forms. So I wanted to hear your comment.
Okay. I think what John was referring to is that on creation day 5, instead of using a single verb for God's creation activity, it uses 2 verbs. So here it's referring to the second origin of life, the birds and mammals and the higher reptiles that actually take care of their young and sacrifice their young. These are the animals we can tame to serve and please us. But it says that God made them and he created them. Now the reason why it uses the 2 verbs, by making them, it's making the reference that God took existing material and assembled the bodies of these birds and mammals and higher reptiles. But he created something brand new that never existed before. And that's a reference to the soulishness of these creatures, how they're endowed with mind, will, and emotions, so that they can form these social bonds, these emotional relationships with one another and with us human beings. And when you get to human beings, you see the same double verb structure. God made us and he created us. Part of our human entity is made from previously existing stuff. The soulishness was there before, the physical bodies was there before. What's brand new is our spirit. And what God is really talking about here is how he created these birds and mammals to serve a higher species. He created us human beings to serve a higher being. This is what Job is saying when he says, look to the birds, they'll teach you. Look to the beasts of the field, the land mammals, they'll instruct you. They'll tell you about yourself and about God and how you can come into relationship with God. And what's interesting about how the book of Job ends, God says to Job and his friends, you've been able to tame all the nephesh animals. You've even been able to tame the hippopotamus. You've even been able to tame the Nile crocodile, the 2 most difficult to tame of all the nephesh creatures. But he says there's one that you can't tame. You cannot bring humility to a proud human heart. It takes a higher being to do that. And basically he's telling them, you've got to come to me if you really want to have the taming that you need to successfully live your life here and in the life to come.
A question about the PowerPoint before we take another one from the floor. The question is just, is there a place to get a copy of the PowerPoint? So maybe I'll broaden that and just say the specific details in the PowerPoint, where would be the best place to go?
Well, we purposely have made this is a keynote, it's not a PowerPoint, but it's all public domain stuff. It's either public domain or it's our stuff. So we're willing to make it available. And you can either get the keynote or we can give you a PDF or the JPEGs, however you like. And there's one that you want, just let us know. So we can make that available.
Excellent. Another question from the floor, back here.
So I'm a little bit confused on, in all the time the Earth has existed, there's been these different times, as you were talking about with global temperatures or climates, there's been different times where we've been having like good climate like we have right now, where the glaciers have receded, we have a lot of good minerals and different great conditions for living. But these haven't existed only now. They've existed earlier in history. I'm confused on why would God wait this long, over these many millions, billions of years, to create humans and life when there's been other opportunities?
Well, I'm arguing there has not been other opportunities. That it takes us being at the end of the Ice Age cycle, where we follow the most severe of the Ice Ages in the Ice Age cycle, where we get this extreme climate stability and optimal temperature to enable us to have a large population and high technology. That condition has never existed before in the 4.57 billion year history of the Earth. It's only been present for the last 9,000 years. This is a unique time in the history of the Earth. Now, another benefit of being here now as, say, a billion years ago, or half a billion, well, actually, if you go back a billion years ago, there isn't enough oxygen to keep us going. It literally takes billions of years to build up the oxygen. Why does it take so long with all the photosynthetic life? Because, well, it's what you learn here at this university, is that the Earth is filled with these very hungry oxygen sinks, the crust of the Earth and the mantle of the Earth, and it takes photosynthetic life thriving for 3.8 billion years to sufficiently fill those oxygen sinks where we can actually get 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. So only in the last couple 100 million years have we had that quantity of oxygen. We couldn't be here any earlier than that. But the other big benefit of coming so late upon the scene is that all the previous life on planet Earth has been building up biodeposits: coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, marble, gypsum. In fact, if you look at our book, Navigating Genesis, in a matter of days, we actually tabulate for you how much we have in the way of biodeposits. It exceeds 76 quadrillion tons. And because of that huge treasure chest of biodeposits, we can have freeways, we can have skyscrapers, and we can have all the metallurgy that enables us to enjoy our high technology civilization.
Isn't that necessary only if we're following sin? Because then those things only come about because of sin. So why would God put us in a time where we're being provided, like, sort of on that path?
I don't get your point. Where's the sin?
Because, like, we were living in the Garden of Eden before, like, sin occurred, before Adam ate the apple,
Right,
etc.
right.
Would those things not have come about if he hadn't have followed a sinful route?
Okay. If Adam and Eve had not sinned, basically what God was saying in Genesis 1, I've given you these resources, manage it for the benefit of all life. He was basically saying to Adam and Eve, see what's here in the garden? Make the rest of the world like that. But then they sinned, and yes, the world is not as productive as it otherwise would be. Genesis 3:17, cursed is the ground because of you. So our agricultural land isn't as productive as it would be if we were not abusing the agricultural land. Nevertheless, because of the way God has designed the earth and the 3.8 billion years of life history, it's still incredibly productive. Now, we actually see prophecies in the Bible that the creator of the universe came here 2,000 years ago and sacrificed himself to deliver us from the consequences of sin, but he's also promised to come back. And when he comes back, we're going to see the productivity of the planet go up to its full potential. So I agree with you, it's not at its full potential now, but it's still at an amazingly high potential given the conditions, compared to the conditions that existed before we were placed in the Garden of Eden.
All right, I have another written question here. Before I do that, I'll also just mention in regards to the question about the keynote presentation. If you're interested in all of these presentations this week, feel free to fill out a card with your information, and we will let you know because we're going to be having all of those available. The speakers have kindly given their permission to allow that, so that might be another means. This question from a student is asking if you could comment on how you view the relationship, or maybe the coexistence is the word they use, between science and religion.
Coexistence between science and religion. Let me take you back to the Reformation. What happened at the Reformation is it wasn't just priests that were allowed to read the Bible. Everybody could read the Bible, and the Bible was being translated into common languages. And what happened then is that ordinary people reading the Bible saw this command to put everything to the test. Don't believe. Test everything. Hold fast to that which is good. Those with a scientific bent also saw in the Bible what we now refer to as the scientific method. Incidentally, that was a big factor in my becoming a Christian. Looking at texts like Genesis 1 and other creation texts and realizing this is where the scientific method comes from. It comes from the pages of Scripture. And it's no accident that the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. And what you see in the Reformation is that when they came up with the Reformation creeds, they were founded on the two books doctrine, that God gave us two books of revelation, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And what you see in the book of Scripture is repeated commands to go to nature in order to establish that God exists, the attributes of God, and recognize the reliability and trustworthiness of the book of Scripture. And that's something we practice at Reasons to Believe. We use the book of nature to bring people to the book of Scripture. In the Belgic Confession, Article 2, God gave us two books, the book of Scripture, the book of nature. Both are revelations from God. Both are utterly trustworthy and reliable, and both corroborate one another. Now, I know that doctrine's coming under attack today at certain seminaries, but hey, we're advocating at Reasons to Believe. Let's go back to our Reformation roots.
Wonderful. I will come to this question in just a moment. I just want to make sure there's no more student questions. There are over here, so right here.
Okay, so I might be misunderstanding you, but so if I am, then please correct me. But it sounded like you were saying something about deposit forming before we even come into the garden. So basically the question is, how did the dinosaurs die, or go extinct? And the reason why I ask that is because when we read the Genesis accounts, we can't really see how dinosaurs fit in there. They died, was a sin because of the fall of Satan? And if it's because of the fall of Satan, then does it mean that when was the use dinosaurs created? And how were they in existence for the fall of Satan to affect them?
Sure. Okay, he's talking about dinosaurs, the death of dinosaurs before human beings. Dinosaurs are not mentioned anywhere in the Bible, just like Pi Mesons aren't mentioned anywhere in the Bible, or Neanderthals are not mentioned. The Bible is a book for all generations, so you will only find vocabulary that communicates to all generations. We humans have only known about dinosaurs for the past 200 years. But in terms of your specific question, Psalm 104, verses 26 through to about verse 30, it says, the property of all life to die off. All life is bound to die off just based on the laws of physics that God established in the universe. As it says in Romans 8, the entire creation is subject to the law of decay. So Psalm 104, it's the property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. And so the pattern in God's creation, he creates life on planet Earth, he removes that life, replaces it with different life. Now that raises a question, why would God do that? Well, because of the physics that God established, all stars change in their luminosity over their burning history. The sun, for example, is about 25% more luminous today than when we have the first life on planet Earth. And with the sun getting progressively brighter and brighter, it's necessary that the atmosphere of the Earth be chemically transformed to compensate for the brightening of the sun. Life can only tolerate about a 1% change in the luminosity of the sun. And what so God does is he creates initially life that leaves a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But as the sun gets brighter, he takes that life away and replaces it with new life that's more efficient at removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. That's how we're able to have an abundance of life for such a long period of time. The theme of Psalm 104, God is packing our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, for as long as possible. But that requires relatively frequent replacements of life with new life in order to compensate for the changes in the physics of the sun. Follow it.
I believe Psalm 104 is talking about the earth as it is right now, not the earth as how God created it.
I can't quite hear you.
I believe Psalm 104 is talking about the earth as it is right now, how the natural world as it is right now, because Romans 8 says that creation awaits the manifestation of the sons of God, that even creation itself was subjected to futility. So God did not create anything to die. Death comes from Satan. God is life. Everything in God lives. So the reason why I'm kind of saying this is I think sometimes you have to be careful in terms of analyzing this, because what we are doing is we are using what we see now in the natural to to predict what was before time. What we have now is different from what we had before.
Okay, let me give you some scripture passages to clarify that. I mentioned these yesterday in my 12:30 talk. There's 7 passages in the Bible that tell us the laws of physics don't change from the moment of creation up until the full number of human beings that will be redeemed. So there's been no dramatic change in the laws of physics, either at the fall of Adam, at the fall of Satan, or at the flood. The physics has been constant. As God says in Jeremiah 33, you change, I don't change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change. Romans 8 tells us that these laws of physics have been in place for the entire history of the universe. It also tells us a time will come when the laws of physics will change, but that won't happen until the full number of human beings who God intends to redeem will be redeemed, and when all evil and suffering has been once and for all eliminated. So in the last 2 chapters of the Bible, we see a new creation with different physics. The other thing I want to address is that the Bible does not say that death in all contexts is evil. I mean, in fact, when you read the New Testament, every book of the New Testament says if you want to live, you have to die. The only way you can gain eternal life is being willing to die to self. When we celebrate baptism, it symbolizes the death of the old man and the resurrection of the new man. God saw fit to put his own son to the death so that we human beings can experience life. So I think it's a theological mistake to say that death in all contexts is evil. I also think it's a mistake to give too much credit to Satan's fall or to Adam's fall. It didn't make God powerless. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He was in control of both events, and we're actually beneficiaries of Satan being the first one to experience sin. I explain that in my book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. How because of Satan's fall, and he being the most powerful creature God ever created, we have the benefit of being subjected to the most challenging tests in the context of evil. And with God's help, we can pass that most challenging test. And hey, it's roughly analogous to the PhD degree that I have. My PhD degree guarantees I'll never have to be tested for my competency in astronomy for the rest of my life. Based on the idea I've already been subjected to the most difficult tests, so there really is no more point. God has also seen fit to put each of us to the most difficult tests. But he's also saying to each one of us, I will help you pass the most difficult tests. If you accept my help, I guarantee you will pass it.
Thank you, Dr. Ross.